Welcome to module number 8, and for this module we'll talk about the spatial considerations in sports tourism development. So we'll talk about space and the place where sports attractions can flourish. So for this first video, we'll talk about the spatial analysis of location and travel flows, and we'll talk about the difference between sports attractions and events that are found in central locations and those that are found in peripheral locations. So in sports tourism, considering the space is very important. And this includes the locations and regions in which the specific sports take place, no, kung saan ginagawa yung sport. Next, the travel flows associated with these sports. So, paano yung pagbiyahe ng mga tao to a certain sports destination or sports event. And the ways that these flows can be moderated by both sports and tourism organizers and managers. Now, we also have a term we call distance decay. And distance decay basically has these principles. The power of attractions that the sport may exert upon the travel decision process diminishes as the distance away from the site or venue increases. So, the farther away it is for a potential spectator to go to a specific sports event or sports destination, the lesser the person would be interested in going to that sports attraction. So, that's distance decay, no? Habang lumalayo yung attraction, mas less likely yung decision niya to go and watch or participate in a given event. And also, in relation to the elite sports tourists, no, the further a team travels to compete, the less likely it is that their home-based supporters will accompany them. So, ganun din, no? When they go and participate in an away game, there's less likely that they will be home supporters who will be traveling with them or will be going to their specific event. Now, let's talk about the specific factors that affect distance decay. So, the first one is cultural and climatic characteristics. So, syempre, if the place of origin has a different culture or has a different climate than the place of destination where the sports event is happening, then there is more likely that distance decay will happen. Next, we have transport routes and attractions found along the way. So, syempre, if the transport route, whether it's by air, land, or sea, is very comfortable, no, there is a good transportation system to get from the place of origin to the place of destination, then there is higher likely that distance decay will be shortened, and there is higher likelihood that a certain person will go and follow a certain team or a certain sports event. And also, another consideration are the attractions found along the way. So, if there are attractions in that transportation route that they can stop and of course humor themselves and visit as another part of their attractions list or itinerary, then there is a higher likelihood for them to attend a given sports event in a far away place. The next is we have quality of sport and competition, and this is the reason why despite coming from different remote locations in the globe, they would still travel and watch the Olympics because of the quality of competition that they will be able to see. And there are of course a lot of sports that are found there, and this is only just a once in a lifetime chance to be able to see these athletes play at their peak training and their peak performance. So, the more quality of the sport, the distance decay becomes lesser. Next is spheres of influence of teams to spectators. No, for instance, you really want to support the team, and of course, the team is also very much closer to their fans and their spectators. The tendency is that the spectators will follow where the team goes for them to support the team, diba? So, the influence that the team has in the spectators, will of course influence the decreasing of the distance decay. Now, Bale suggested the theory of sports locations in 1989, and this basically will also help us not only in terms of organizing sports events, but also in terms of organizing and developing sports tourism attractions. So Bale shared a few principles under the theory. The first statement is the main function of sports location is to provide sports outlets for a surrounding hinterland or the location, no, the place of origin. Sports facilities are therefore centrally located within their market areas. So of course, when we build sports locations, usually tourism isn't the first primary function that we're thinking of, no? Usually our catchment or our market is not really people coming from farther areas, no? Usually we are catering to people who are near the sports location. So if there are a lot of people who are interested in doing basketball or doing volleyball or doing swimming in a certain place, then you will build sports locations in that area to be able to cater to the needs of the people within that area. So usually second natin yung priority, or not really our first priority, yung tourism potentials ng isang sports location when we build them, because again, like we said, no, it's for those who are part of the surrounding hinterland or the place where the sports location is going to be erected. And now also Bale classified sports location into high order and low order location. And high order locations are those sports location with higher number of sports provided. So probably a higher level of location in the Philippines is, for example, here we have the MOA Arena, because MOA Arena could be a basketball court, can also be a volleyball court, or probably you have also the Rizal Memorial sports center, no, wherein you have a lot of activities that can be done there, like track and field, gymnastics, badminton, swimming, diving, and other related sports, kasi nga sports center siya. So higher order locations are fewer in number, no, and are more widely spaced from each other. Syempre, it doesn't feel so logical to place sports center near each other, because they're just going to be competing with the same population. So usually we place siguro one per city, and of course the complexity per city iba-iba. So for example, no, I feel like Marikina Sports Center would have a different set of availabilities and opportunities than compared to Quezon City Sports Center, etc., etc. And then of course they have large population threshold. So higher order location, of course, they cater to a large number of sports and a large number of spectators. Next, we have low order sports location, and unlike high order sports location, they provide sporting facilities used by smaller catchment areas, so lower number of participants, lower number of spectators, and lower number of available sporting activities. Like for example, you have your badminton rentals, you have your ice skating rink sa SM, no, or for instance, you have your swimming pool in an aquatic center, no. So these are example of low order sports location. Mas konting sport ang pwedeng gawin in that specific area, lesser spectators and lesser participants. So for example, ito sa picture is your dragon boat racing done in a river in Hong Kong. Of course, there are many things that you can do in Hong Kong and then in the river, but of course hindi siya kasing dami ng higher order sports locations like arenas and stadium. And a hierarchy of sports location exists in order to make efficient and as possible the arrangement of sports opportunities for consumers who wish to minimize their travel to obtain the sport that they want, and B, producers of sports who must maintain a minimum thresholds of customers to survive. So let's go first with the first note. This is for consumers who wish to minimize their travel to obtain the sport that they want. So usually the consumers would go to higher order sporting locations, because especially if they want to enjoy more sports, then that is where they go. Or if their sport is a niche sport, like for example skiing or mountain climbing, then alam nila kung saan sila pupunta, no, at alam nila explikin nila. And also very important for those who produce sport events and who manage sports events, to be able to choose a specific sport location wherein they will be able to get the participants and athletes that they need and accommodate them, to accommodate the number of customers for them to be able to manage and economically yung kanilang endeavor, no, yung event na ginagawa nila. Other factors that can be put in terms of sports location, we have of course facility sharing, no. Example ng facility sharing is kung pwede ba na yung same space may dalawang sport na nangyayari? So for example, if you see in this picture, 'di ba, ay just like yung nakikita natin sa Rizal Memorial, 'di ba, the Coliseum, we have a track and field, and at the same time we also have a football court dun sa gitna. No, so there are multiple sports that can be done in a specific space. And of course, we have travel nodes, meaning are there's near airports, near bus terminals, near transportation centers. Another would be the proximity to tourism areas, which is also very important, especially for sports tourists who also wants to experience other types of tourism other than their sport activities. And of course, your media markets, are they near media organizations or are they accessible to media organization? And the transportability of the sport. We will discuss this more later, but definitely the transportability of sport means that pwede bang gawin sa iba-ibang space yung mga sport, hindi kailangan ba ito na nakikita sa isang spot lang, or can we be able to transport the sport in different arenas, stadium or spaces? So we'll talk about that later. Now, there are two general locations that we talk about in tourism. The first one are central locations and the second one is peripheral locations. So, central locations talk about urban centers, like for example in the Philippines, Manila, Metro Davao, Metro Cebu. When we talk about peripheral locations, we're talking about rural areas. Usually, generally, tourism is catering to peripheral locations, to rural locations, especially for domestic tourism. We rarely go touring in urban centers. We usually go out of the urban centers and go to peripheral locations. But in sports tourism, it's really variable whether you find a certain sports attraction in a central location, in urban area, in a peripheral area, or a rural area. And it's really dependent on the sport that is being done. But when we place the sporting event in a central location, there are certain characteristics or there are certain consideration that must be taken into consideration. And of course, same thing with those that are part of the peripheral location. So first, we'll talk about central locations. So, of course, as I explained earlier, central locations are those found in urban centers. And one of the biggest consideration is whether this is a home or an away game. Syempre, if it's a home game, then we expect the home team to have a lot of supporters because they are also found the supporters are also found in central locations, no? And of course, pag away games, lesser yung mga supporters that are cheering for the given team. In central locations, we expect more passive tourists than active tourists. Kasi usually nga, the central locations, we find higher order sports locations. So there are a lot of sports happening here, and a lot of the athletes are already staying in central locations. So they don't really have to migrate, and move elsewhere. They just have to go to the sporting area near them. So ang mga dadayo ay yung mga tagalabas, yung mga manonood. And of course, like we said, in higher order sports locations, mas marami silang na-accommodate ng mga manonood. And so, therefore, most likely, ang ina-expect nating type of tourism for central location sports attractions are domestic tourism, from peripheral areas going to central locations. And of course, there are other considerations of how we can further treat sports locations in central areas. Like your sports venues can have, MICE venues. When you say MICE, meetings, incentives, conferences, and events. So this is for large events. Like for example, yung MOA Arena, that can also be a place wherein you can have your debut or your wedding or a big business conference, when it's not used for sports, and also some sports venues who also are treated as MICE venues sometimes can also already have tourism and hospitality services. So baka meron silang accommodation or meron silang tour operators and travel agents working in that venue, so that sports tourists who go there or those who are going there for MICE related tourism will already have tourism services available for them. So this development of a kind of sports location that has MICE capability and has an input or has an included tourism hospitality services are called sports tourism centers, because they don't just hold sports events and sports tourism events, but they also hold other tourism events as well. And of course, usually, in central locations, this is where we find your nostalgia sports tourism. Again, ano na nga yung nostalgia sports tourism? These are tourism attractions related to sport that are usually to be able to commemorate a lot of histories in which histories and cultures related to sports. So, for example, we have the PSC Museum, the Philippine Sports Commission Museum. No, we also have other museums, and we also have cultural centers, and even sometimes sports bars and sports restaurants that features different memorabilia from old sports stars. So that's nostalgia tourism. Usually we find nostalgia tourism attractions in central locations. So, of course, iba naman ang consideration natin with peripheral locations. Now, pag peripheral locations, ito naman yung mga locations ng sport where we find in rural areas. So, as explained here. So, usually, what are the sports that we see that are being conducted in rural areas? So, example, we have your skiing, your biking, your sailing, your surfing, your rock climbing, and mountain climbing, and these are dependent on natural resources which are found in natural spaces found in rural areas. And compared to central sports location, we find more active tourists than passive tourists, kasi dumadayo sila to be able to engage in the sport that they will not be able to find in the central locations where they are. So, we can expect both domestic tourists coming from central locations, traveling to rural areas for them to be able to experience these types of sports like surfing, or mountain climbing, and also international tourists who come from developed countries who don't have the natural resources in their countries to be able for them to experience a given sport, or siguro probably find a new terrain for their sport and visit these peripheral locations where certain sports are being held. And of course, as explained earlier, we find more lower order sports location in rural areas, in peripheral locations. Usually the locations that we find can only cater to small number of sports. Unlike you have your stadium and your arena that can have multiple sports. But the consideration for peripheral location is not really the number of sports found in the location, but the quality of the environment that allows for the sports to flourish. And usually, those who go to peripheral locations are more likely to go there just to engage in the sport. Hindi katulad ng central location na isa pa sa mga consideration nila ay mag-tour din, na outside sports attractions. But of course, hindi naman nawawala na may mga tourists din na gustong maghanap ng ibang touristic activities sa area. But of course, since peripheral location yon, it's limited, kasi nga yung access, yung transportation access internally and externally ay limited. So, in this video, we were able to talk about the importance of space in creating sports location. We talked about distance decay. We talked about the hierarchy of sports location, and we talked about the considerations of sports locations for both the central location and peripheral locations.